And now I would like to bring on a licensed psychologist who specializes in spiritual abuse and cultural abuse. Here is Dr. Feluso Solarin. I am so glad to bring on the Bare Marriage podcast Dr. Felucia, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and who is specialized in spiritual abuse and trauma. So, Dr. Felucia, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Sheila. I really appreciate it.
Now, you reached out to me because you saw what I was talking about and you're like, oh my goodness, I completely track with you. So
Yes.
tell us before we get into the conversation of how this relates to marriage and everything, how do you define spiritual abuse?
Okay. So spiritual abuse is, in its broadest definition, is somebody misusing their spiritual authority, right? So it's a misuse of spiritual authority, and that authority is used to harm the individuals who are being abused. And the way that spiritual abuse works is that it oftentimes is manifested when the spiritual abuser is trying to control the person who is being abused, and trying to basically override their will, right? And so that's usually that's one form of abuse. A lot of times people think of spiritual abuse happening in major obvious ways, such as in cults, very drastic ways where people are very isolated from their family. You see these big changes, but oftentimes spiritual abuse can be quite subtle. And so, people who have experienced spiritual abuse sometimes are in situations where they're being abused by others, and they're looking to their church congregation to step in and help. And so when they don't, when they either, when they just say, well, this is your problem because you're in sin or whatnot, and they don't use their authority to help, but they take a passive, like hands-off approach, that is also spiritual abuse. And so oftentimes people are, when they're in these situations, experience another level of abuse because they're being shamed, told the abuse is their fault, and then encouraged or even mandated to go back to that abusive situation.
Right. Now, what about spiritual trauma? Is that different from abuse? Obviously, it's a byproduct of abuse, but can people have spiritual trauma even if they haven't overtly been abused?
Oh, much, yes, definitely. So by being in, a spiritually abusive environment can, and oftentimes creates trauma for those involved. People watching other people being harmed, that can be traumatic for somebody to see. So for instance, if they're hearing threats from the pulpit, if they are seeing people who they know need help and her being, turned away or shamed, that can be abusive because they, someone who may not be experiencing it directly wonders about their own value and wonders what can happen to them, how this isn't a safe place. They know it and they feel it physically as well.
Yeah. I know. Let me give you an example. I know I was in a church situation where I was leading a praise team. This was probably 15, 20 years ago. It was a long time ago. But I was leading a praise team, and the church deacons board didn't feel that it was okay for me to pray between songs or say something. Like one Sunday, I think the first Sunday I led, between the songs, I said, before you sing this next song, picture the things that you came into church stressed with. And picture yourself, leaving them at the foot of the cross, and look to Jesus as you sing this next song. Like, that's all I said. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't a huge thing. It was just like, leave your burdens at the foot of the cross and sing the song. And they debated for a year whether I was allowed to do that because I was a woman.
Oh, wow.
And there were 3 other praise team leaders, because we had 4 praise teams, and they were all led by men. And it was a really difficult time. And I don't think it was until probably 2 years ago that I recognized how much trauma I went through with that, because I had to get up every month and lead a team and act like I was happy, but I knew everyone there was going to be watching every single word I said.
Wow.
And sometimes I think we go through things like that and we don't even realize it at the time, how much it's taking out of us.
Yes, I can, I'm sorry you went through that. And I can imagine, how, not only how difficult that must be, but the sense of sort of, what you say resonates with a lot of other people who've been in similar situations where they feel devalued through no fault of their own. And because we are, we automatically, we tend to assume the best of our spiritual leaders. We look to them as speaking, on behalf of God. It can be challenging and it can be anxiety provoking to say, well, I don't agree with this, or I'm going to go against this. In spiritual abuse, we hear language often being weaponized. So somebody who says, well, I don't agree, or can you explain more, can be labeled as divisive, sowing discord, rebellious, things like that. So in that situation, I don't want to just speak for what you went through, but you likely felt, hey, this is an authority telling me that to do this. I'm just going to go along and going through the motions, but inside probably not feeling all that great. And then not realizing later, something wasn't right about this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think one of the issues with church situations too is that many women have told me it's in church where I have felt the most devalued.
Yeah.
It's in church where I have felt the most judged. And it shouldn't be like that. But have you seen that happen with your clientele?
Yes, definitely. That has been the case. And the part that makes it the most, I wouldn't say the most, but a part that can make that very painful is because of our expectations. We expect to be to be welcomed in church, to be valued for who, to be valued as God's creation. I'm not saying that, because you go to church, you should just be allowed to do anything and get away with anything, but the place where, church, we don't associate church and feeling shamed and devalued. We have higher expectations, as we should. I mean, if we look in the Bible talks about, what are some of the expectations of us as members and as well as leaders. And so for someone to feel constantly shamed and constantly devalued is not a good thing at all.
And I want to stress too, we're not saying that all churches are like this, right?
No, not at all. Not at all.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I love the church. I think church is wonderful. And there are lots of very good experiences that I know a lot of people have had, but it's very important also to bring awareness, because when we think about spiritual abuse, people who have been in situations like that often say that they feel that the needs of the leader, protecting the reputation of the leader, and their feelings come above those of the congregants. And that's not the model the Bible shows. And so it's really important that we are looking out for the sheep, for people who are attending church, and using and being able to value their well-being as well. And so that's really important. This is not a, like you said, not a church bashing session, but there are some very harmful things. It's kind of like what you said before in one of your podcasts about the, the thalidomide effect, right? And so maybe there were plenty of babies that were fine when their mothers took the thalidomide. Thalidomide is a drug that can have teratogenic effects, basically meaning that children can come from the womb with missing limbs and all these horrible birth defects. And so some may be fine, right? But then others, when they do go through it, it's very devastating. And there are people that are walking away from their faith, from the Lord, from Christianity, because of spiritual abuse and trauma.
Right. Now, I want to help our listeners to understand this, because I think there's been so much talk about spiritual abuse in the news, especially when it relates to sexual abuse. So, when a pastor, a leader, whatever, is using their position to sexually abuse, to coerce women into whatever situation. We've had many, many, many high profile things about that. Ravi Zacharias, Carl Lentz, et cetera, et cetera. But that isn't the only kind of abuse. You think about Mark Driscoll, for instance, who was let go, or James McDonald, both of whom were let go from the mega church system that they founded because they had an abusive style of leadership. And that abusive style of leadership is not limited to mega churches. You can have an abusive leader in a very small church.
Yes, it's true.
But can you were saying, sometimes it can be what they say in the pulpit. Can you give us an example or several of what that would look like if someone is being abusive from the pulpit?
So one example I can think of that I've heard of personally with some people is perhaps when they go for counseling, with they're going to counseling, and there's that expectation of confidentiality. And so maybe they go to a pastor or they go to a leader and they explain a situation that's close to home, a deep personal situation. There's the expectation of confidentiality, right? And then maybe they
Mm-hmm.
hear their story being retold from the pulpit in a shaming way. So for instance, maybe, a woman is having some postpartum issues and she's having real difficulty connecting with her children and her husband. She goes to get counseling for that. And then
Mm-hmm.
from the pulpit, they might hear something like, oh, women nowadays really need to snap back after having their kids. And, you have other responsibilities. You have a husband that needs you, you have other kids that need you. And so, but basically the woman in that congregation would understand that that was her story being told,
Mm-hmm.
and she's being indirectly shamed. Maybe the pastor did not use her name, but she's like, oh, I was just there
Mm-hmm.
seeing them a few days ago about this, and now I'm being labeled as a bad mother and a bad, wife. Something along the lines of that, maybe a couple talking about some sexual issues, after postpartum, the postpartum period. And then the pastor saying something along the lines of, well, women should always be sexually available to their husbands, no matter what, and don't use childbirth as an excuse, something along those lines. And so that is a way of, even if nobody else knows that they had that conversation, she understands that that was an attack against her. Sometimes people do use names that can, they may not use names, but they don't conceal the information so everybody knows who the pastor or the leader is talking about. Threats are another way as well too. So saying, if you don't do this or you don't do this, things that maybe may not be related to salvation, external factors that the leader has put above the word of God, like maybe serving a certain number of hours a week or giving a certain amount of money to the church. If you don't do X, Y, and Z, you're going to have some very bad things happen to you in life.
Right. Yeah, that is very manipulative. And again,
Yes,
trying to
manipulation is the word I'm
control.
looking for. Yeah, and trying to control your will,
Yeah.
because we should give and serve joyfully, because that's something God has called us to do, not under threat of punishment or retaliation.
I talk to a lot of women who have been reading my books, listening to the podcast, and they're starting to realize there's some major issues in their church. Often it's the way that the church views women, or the way that the church handles abuse or divorce, anything like that. And they just feel like, I can't trust my pastor anymore. I feel empty when I go to church, but their husband doesn't feel that way.
That's
And
tough.
that's a really difficult thing to say. I get that question all the time. What do I do when I really don't like our church anymore, but my husband thinks it's great? Do you have any words of wisdom for them?
Definitely. I mean, first of all, continue, to pray and ask God for wisdom. And while you're praying and asking for God for wisdom, also take action. Some of the action steps I recommend are document everything. Sometimes we can see situations differently, but if we have cold hard facts to back up what we're saying, it's important. So something along the lines of writing, if it's when someone said that their situation doesn't feel safe, what about it doesn't make you feel safe? Is it the way other members are treating you? Sometimes we see in spiritually abusive situations that it's somebody who is in the recipient of abuse feels very isolated, and so being given the silent treatment by others because they spoke up, it can be very subtle. And so that's why it's very important to document. So for instance, we could say something like, I was in a conversation with 3 different women and I spoke to them and none of them really acknowledged me. I felt like I was being ignored. They might, someone, just facts, or maybe so-and-so walked by, I said hi to them, they looked at me and they did not respond. And I know they saw me. This happens week after week. That's important, because abuse can also happen in silent treatment type situations, or ignoring the person and shunning them, right? So we're not going to kick you out, but we're going to make sure that you feel unwelcome here. Something along the lines of, there was a meeting the other day. I was given an hour notice before I had to attend. When I attended, this was what was said to me. Take notes. I think that's really important, so that you have an objective factual record of what you're experiencing, and then also talk about how it's affecting you. I'm having difficulty sleeping. I feel anxiety when I step in the church building. My hands are shaking. I don't feel safe. And it's really important, because if one person doesn't feel valued as part of a family and a church system, then I wonder how worth it is for everyone to keep going, because whatever the woman or whoever it is, it could be men as well, being abused, it's going to affect the whole family system.
Yeah, like you matter. You matter. And it's
Yes.
okay. It's okay. If you're not comfortable, that should matter. I know a lot of parents too, they may start even sometimes the husband and wife are on the same team, and they don't think the church is teaching what is healthy from the pulpit. They're not sure that they even believe some of the doctrines of the church anymore. They still love Jesus. I get
Yes.
these notes all the time. We still love Jesus, but we just can't buy into this view of sexism or how they handle race or whatever it might be. But our kids are really, really happy in the youth group. And
Yes, I hear that
our
sometimes
kids are
too.
really, really happy in Sunday school. What would you suggest to parents like that?
Well, I wonder, that's tough. And I don't want to say do X or do Y. What I would ask them to do is to see if they're concerned. I mean, kids can be really happy in a particular situation, but the types of doctrine that are being espoused from the pulpit, I would ask, is this only in the adult situations, or is it leaking over to children's church and youth group? Because chances are there may be some sprinklings of that in there as well. So really take an investigative approach and see, and first of all, see what the kids are being exposed to. Sometimes it is the case and sometimes it's not, but perhaps try and work out something where, maybe if the kids are meeting on a separate day, sometimes if like a youth group is meeting on a weekend or something something like that, parents can go to a different church and then their kids can still be part of the youth group. Sometimes I've seen situations like that work, but it's really important to take a very measured, objective response to see how this is affecting everybody. And, as I understand that our children's well-being, it's important. It's we want to make sure that they feel valued. But again, if the system isn't in agreement, the family system is in agreement, and there's some challenges from one end, then we may have to evaluate, well, what if we were to try something else out for a while? Maybe they could be happy somewhere else. It's important to just not put any option off the table.
Right, exactly. Okay, another scenario that I get a lot is couples or women or whoever it might be, somebody in the family will say, okay, so I've realized that certain books are harmful, or I've realized certain teachings are harmful, and I went to my pastor and they completely blew me off. I went to my pastor with
Yeah.
a really good argument. I had documentation of what was wrong with this book. I was really well prepared, and they blew me off. Now,
Okay.
obviously, it's okay for pastors to not agree with everybody. Like, not,
Yes.
you're not always going to agree with everything on with your pastor. But if this is something that's important to you, what should we expect from our pastors if they're
Okay.
healthy?
Great question. What we would expect from them is, what would we expect from ourselves? So if we put ourselves in that situation, maybe you're a teacher having some sort of leadership position and someone comes to you with concerns, it's very important to make sure that those concerns are validated and you are looking at it. You are able to empathize and see the concerns from their point of view. So for instance, if you're going to the pastor and saying, I'm having these concerns, the goal of the meeting isn't for one person to say, well, you have to do things my way or you have to do things my way, but understand what are the concerns that are the root of the issue. So for some of those marriage books that you talked about, they don't value women really or men because of the harmful teachings, and and talk about it from the perspective of what is the common ground that we can establish from here. So maybe the pastor may decide that they still want to keep the book as a part of her curriculum, but they also understand why that teaching is harmful. So it's really important. I don't want to say that you shouldn't focus on a goal, because the books, so for instance, if your goal is to say, look, I really don't feel comfortable with these books being in the church, that shouldn't be the only goal. We don't want to just be laser focused on that. It's really important to understand the mechanism behind the books and the overall harmful teaching that may do harm to members and leaders. And so if you look at it from the perspective of how does this affect the well-being of us all as a church, and go into that from that perspective, I think it would be very helpful. And also assume good intentions. You know, say you could talk to the pastor about how you know that they're invested in the spiritual growth of their members. They want to see them do well. They want to make sure that they're all valued. And this doesn't seem to accomplish that goal. They might say, well, what do you have that's better? You know, what do you recommend instead? And so I think it's also good to have other viable solutions as well, and coming at it from that perspective of collaboration instead of competition or being antagonistic.
I like that. Yeah, because people are on journeys, and maybe your pastor is just learning as well. This might be the first time they've ever heard about this. So
yes,
I know people have gone to pastors and, look, I'm really concerned about this. And the pastor's like, well, I don't see it. But if you keep at it, and you say, like, I'm really on the same page. Now, sometimes the church, you just can't do it anymore. And you've given the pastor lots of chances, but a lot of people are on journeys. And I think it's important that we do honor them. Okay.
Yeah.
I know one of the things that you're very passionate about, though. We've talked about things I'm passionate about. Now let's do what you're passionate about, which is what happens in a much more significant or dangerous situation where, let's say, a woman is being abused at home, and she goes to the church for help, and the church basically blames her for it, or tells her that she needs to go back to her husband, or she needs to submit, or she's being rebellious, or something like that.
Yes, it's really important. I mean, my heart goes out to anybody who's ever been in that situation. It's very important that you're not looking to the church as your only sort of defense or protection. It's really important that, and it's very important that if anyone who's listening to this is in that sort of situation, that you get the proper authorities involved, calling your domestic abuse hotline, National Domestic Abuse Hotline, or one for your county or wherever you are. Make sure that you call that number and get outside authorities involved, because when you're in a situation like that, you oftentimes have you've been isolated by the abuser. And then also if the church system is telling you to go back to them, it's clear that they don't have your best interest at heart. So it's very important to get an outside party involved, somebody who's removed from the system, who can say and look at this and say, this is not normal. This is not healthy. You need to get help, and you need to get help right away. And understanding that in many of these situations, scriptures are twisted. They're taking a particular verse out of isolation and using it to demean you. Leslie Vernick has talked about this too in her books, that there aren't just certain verses that in the Bible that only apply to marriage, or other verses in the Bible just don't stop being relevant because you're in a marriage situation. So verses that talk about how we're important to God, how we should cry out to justice for him, how our safety, we should guard ourselves, seeing danger and running. There's a verse in that about Proverbs. Those verses don't just stop because you're in a marriage situation. And so it's very important that we are understanding the Bible for itself, and not believing verses that are just taken out of in isolation and out of context to weaponize, to use against you.
Now, I know you have a big counseling practice, and I would imagine that a lot of the people that you talk to and help are people where they loved their church. They were involved in their church their whole life. That was so much a part of their identity. And when they realized they couldn't do it anymore, and they had such trauma, it feels like you've lost your whole life.
Oh, and for many people, that is their whole life. I mean, they've grown up there, they've raised if they're mothers, they've raised their children there, fathers, they've raised their children. It oftentimes works where it appears that to them that this is my whole life, or all my friends are, all my social connections, major life events have been connected to that church and congregation. So if they do decide to step away, there is a major grieving, there's loss, there's shame, because often the stories that I keep hearing over and over again is that nobody reached out to me, nobody checked on me to see how I was doing when I stopped coming, or whether they saw this happened. And so that can be very isolating and compound the already existing feelings of sadness and guilt and shame from the abuse that they experienced.
Mhm. How do you help people get over that or process that? I guess that's maybe a better way to put it.
Right. Well, first of all, creating a safe, non-judgmental space for them to process that, and understanding that this is not normal. What happened to me? This was not normal, and this was not right. This is not how a healthy church system is supposed to function, because many times people don't realize this until later. And so there's this doubting of, well, can there I see a lot of shame, saying, oh my goodness, how did I end up in a situation like this? I should have known better. But what people don't understand is that people who abuse other people, they're very systematic. They can be systematic about it. They target. There's also grooming, just like child abusers groom the people they abuse. That can happen in spiritual situations as well. And
Mhm.
so helping them recover from that shame and understand this is not because you were stupid or because you lacked insight or because of a moral failure on your part, right? And helping them understand these are, and also helping them reframe their experience, right? So when you're in a spiritually abusive situation, there are, kind of like a toxic family, there's certain rules that are espoused. So anybody who criticizes a bad, if you bring up a criticism or a concern, you're a bad person, you're divisive.
Mhm.
Things like charisma over character is another big one. So as long as you're charismatic, and charming, your character doesn't matter. Or another message that someone may get is that my needs are less important than that of the leader. God doesn't value me. So we rework, we identify those rules and identify those system lies, and then step out in courage in defiance of them and say, well, no,
Mhm.
God values me, I have worth, I can speak up courageously, and that does not mean I'm a bad person. God sees what happened to me. God is concerned about the justice being done in this situation. Also helping them understand that going through a really challenging situation like that, it's normal to be mistrustful, and say, oh, I don't know if I want to just jump into this situation, and not feel shame for that. That's actually good, because now your
Mhm.
antenna are up about potentially spiritually abusive situations. So we learn how to navigate that in a healthy
Mhm.
way. Skills that you have now, there are going to be new skills that you learn from emerging from that difficult and traumatic situation. So how to speak up.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much. Outside of marriage, this is probably the biggest question that I get over and over again is how do I navigate my church situation when I just feel so betrayed? So I'm so glad to know there's counselors out there who specialize in this and who are equipped for this and trained in this. So where can people get a hold of you?
Okay, so they can go to my website. It's skillsetcounseling.com. And so I have that website that you can go to, and anyone can book a free 10-minute consultation with me so we can, talk about what your concerns are and see if we're an appropriate fit. And so I'm licensed in Georgia and Michigan, but I can also see people via telehealth versus several states. So via
Mhm.
several states. So if you look on the website, you'll be able to see where, depending on what state you're in, whether I can see you or not. And then also, I
Mhm.
do have some videos addressing some of these topics on my YouTube channel. And so individuals can also go there and maybe ask questions in the comment section, things like that. So I have that
Mhm.
availability as well. And it's important too to understand that this is not a substitute for professional advice. This is educational. It's really important to understand that everyone's situation is going to be
Mhm.
different. So that's why it's really important. I can't stress to get that help if you feel isolated or you're going through an abusive situation. Don't be afraid to reach out. Call an abuse hotline so that you're getting
Mhm.
the intervention and help that you need. But yes, you can go to the website, and there's also a way to email me too through the website as well. So,
Perfect. And I will put the links to all that. And I wanted to stress too, just for education for our listeners, when someone is licensed, it does mean they have to be licensed by certain boards, and different states have different different rules. And that's why people who are licensed can't always practice in every state. If you find someone who says they can practice everywhere, that's actually a red flag. So people who are licensed often have more restrictions because they belong to a governing body. That's a good thing. So I just want to encourage people to really look. Yes, really look for people who are licensed. Licensed clinical psychologists have a lot of training, and have really looked into this. So thank you very much for being here. Again, I will put links to everything in the podcast notes that go along with this. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Sheila. I mean, your book is just a wonderful resource. And I think even though your book does the Great Sex Rescue book, even though that, I mean, it deals, it's an eye opener. And I think that that's a great resource as well for people who are going through, who think, oh, I don't know about what, I don't feel comfortable. I don't know what's going on with my situation. The book is a wonderful resource. I've recommended it to other individuals. And I just think it really helps people read that book and they think, wow, my eyes are open. It's almost like seeing the world and seeing the church world and the spiritual world from a very different but eye-opening and empowering perspective. I can just tell that from your work, you and your team really genuinely value and care about women and the church in general. And you want to see everybody flourish, want to see healthy marriages and healthy families. So thank you for doing the work you do. It's amazing.
Well, thank you for that encouragement. I appreciate that too. I should take you on the road with me. So thank you so much. All right. Well, when we get in our RV next year and we go south, I will hit you up in Atlanta. I will come say hi. Okay. Thanks for joining us. I hope you found these interviews helpful. I know that it can be really rough when you realize that the place where you worship, where all of your friends are, where so much of your identity is also something which is eating at you, which is toxic, which doesn't look anything like the Jesus that you love. And if that's you, please understand that I get it. I've been there too. Next week on our last podcast before Christmas, we'll be talking about where Rebecca and Joanna and I all landed this year and how we don't feel spiritually homeless anymore. We found good places to worship. So if you're in that toxic place, just know that not all churches are like this. They really aren't. And I pray that you will have peace and clarity and that the fog will lift this holiday season. So thank you for joining us on the Bare Marriage Podcast. Please remember to subscribe and download. We're so close to 1 million downloads in 2022, and I'm just thrilled with how many of you listen in every week. I'm very honored. And stay tuned for a shorter podcast next week that is a lot more personal, and that will give the other side of this story about churches. See you then, and take care.